spectacularly, but all right.
Recording
Excellent.
in progress. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, great. I've got the volumes up. Excellent. Let's get started. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this podcast, we'll be looking at the two-edged sword of celebrity through the eyes of New York-based philosopher on Stoicism, returning guest Professor Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, welcome back to The Focus.
It's a pleasure to be here, John.
Massimo, earlier this year, world-famous podcaster and comedian Joe Rogan got into a bit of trouble with his exclusive podcast host platform, Spotify, for spreading misinformation about COVID-19. This led to several high-profile artists leaving Spotify. Then this controversy was quickly followed by another when a compilation video of Rogan liberally using the N-word on his podcast was made public. Rogan has since issued apologies for these lapses in judgment. But what does this tell us about celebrity and the dangers of accepting celebrity opinion and branding as truth in the public domain?
Well, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that we do listen to celebrities about anything other than whatever they're famous for. Of course, if you've ever seen the musical Chicago, there is a bit where one of the main characters says, "I am a celebrity," which means somebody who is famous for being famous. And, if you're famous for being famous, then there is really no reason whatsoever for the rest of us to actually listen to anything you're saying. But of course, there are people who are celebrity for a particular reason. Somebody could be a good actor, an excellent actor, or I just finished watching a European soccer game, and of course, some of the players on the field are celebrities. But I wouldn't even necessarily listen to what they have to say about soccer, because typically, a lot of these people they play soccer, they're good at playing soccer, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you want to listen to what they have to say. But it certainly wouldn't cross my mind to listen to what a soccer player or an actor has to say about vaccines or about politics or about anything else, because in those cases, their opinion is just as valuable as anybody else's opinion. And the only reason we know about it is because they're celebrities, which is kind of becomes circular, right? So I'm listening to you because you're a celebrity. Well, why are you a celebrity? Because I'm listening to you. It's a really bizarre thing. And of course, occasionally, most of the time, there is no harm. Most of the time, celebrities talk their mouth off on whatever, and people listen and nothing happens. But sometimes, as in the cases you have listed, and then there are several others, unfortunately, over the last many years, then you have things that really have consequences, right? So you have either the use of offensive language, either misogynist or racist language, or you have scientific misinformation, misinformation about things that actually affect the health of people. Now, the two are different, however, right? So there are two different cases. In the case of misogynist or racist language, the effect of it is offense, right? So somebody gets offended, and the level of discourse is brought down, because if it's one thing if you're using certain terminology or you're saying certain things with your relatives at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, it's another thing if you actually reach millions of people who then might get the impression that that sort of talk is acceptable or to be encouraged, etc. So that's one negative effect, that it is, two, I suppose. It is offensive, but more importantly, I think, it brings down the level of discourse in society where we probably don't want it. The second example, the case of somebody who says untrue things about vaccines or about anything that has to do with science, and therefore with facts. At that point, it's not even a matter of opinion, because if you have certain opinions about women that I might consider misogynist, for instance, well, you're entitled to your opinions. I mean, I can be offended. As I said, I might think that that's not really a good idea to sort of broadcast those opinions widely, but you are entitled to it. But in the case of facts, I don't think you're entitled to different facts. You're entitled to think about the facts in different ways, but not to different facts. And the definition of misinformation is of somebody who actually provides false or distorted view of facts. And that, of course, as we know, has consequences, right? I mean, there are people, arguably worldwide, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, died more than they should have during the COVID pandemic. Because of misinformation, because of people either making these into an ideological or political issue and so on and so forth. So it is a really good question of, why are we listening to people like Joe Rogan? By the way, full disclosure, I've been actually a guest of Joe Rogan before he started this podcast. So I met the guy, and in person, he's an interesting guy. I mean, he's way out there for sure. But there's nothing wrong with being way out there. I enjoyed the hour or so that I spent with him in LA a few years ago. But we really need to ask ourselves as a society, why is it that we're listening to these people in these circumstances? And of course, what are we going to do about it? Right? Because even if we agree, we meaning a majority of people agree that the Joe Rogans of the day are not actually doing a service to humanity. Well, does that mean that they should be shut down? Does that mean that that Spotify should take away their show, which they haven't, by the way, because of course they're making money for Spotify. So of course Spotify isn't going to get taken away. Anyway, so what should be done about it? And one of the things that often comes into play with these situations is the concept of freedom of speech, particularly in the United States. People immediately start talking about constitutional right to free speech and stuff like that. That is a profound misunderstanding that a lot of Americans, at least, seem to have. The Constitution of the United States defends the people against the oppression of free speech in the case in which the government is attempting to shut you down, not in the case of a private company. If Spotify decides tomorrow to pull the plug and shut down Joe Rogan, that is no violation of freedom of speech at a constitutional level, period. Because there is no constitutional protection of free speech in a private situation. That is a private company. They can do whatever the hell they want. The same is when social media companies like Twitter or Facebook shut down certain sites or even kick out certain people, like let's say a former president of the United States, right? In the case of Twitter, the notion that somehow is infringing on the constitutional right of these people to have their speech heard is nonsense, because there is no such a thing. There's no such right. If the government were to come in and shut them down, then there would be a constitutional protection. But these are private companies.
So basically what you're saying is that there's a gross misunderstanding of what freedom of speech is all about, at least in the United States and probably elsewhere as well. I mean, we think that there is a thing called freedom of speech just sitting there out in the firmament, and we should be, bowing and scraping before it. But of course, with these so-called freedoms comes a sense of social responsibility, and those elements of social responsibility often clash with freedom of speech. This, I don't think this is going to get any better anytime soon, though, Massimo. I mean, we've got now actors who used to be very, very heavily managed many years ago before the social media explosion. So, they may be very good, at doing what they do. They can deliver a blockbuster movie. The studios make lots and lots of money. Everyone goes home happy after seeing a good film. But now, because we're all fans of, say, actor X or Y or Z, we can follow their tweets. We can follow their social media posts. And as we're starting to get to know our celebrities, our chosen celebrities, more and more by what they put out or burp out into the Twitterverse, we find out that perhaps they're not the heroic figures that are in our imagination. And I suppose this goes for Rogan as it goes for everyone else, who starts stepping into this particular domain.
Yeah.
It's not going to get any easier or better for us, is it?
No, I think it's gonna get worse. Yeah, you're right. There are a number of examples. I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow, for instance, has been selling all sorts of nonsense, pseudoscientific nonsense, for many years and making a bundle of money out of it. And the entire anti-vax movement in the United States started out because of celebrities, because of actors or actresses and models going on national television shows and spouting nonsense about vaccines. So, yeah, this is happening. You're right. Your observation is absolutely correct. I think that it used to be that not only celebrities, actors, musicians, etc., but politicians were very strictly managed, as you put it, because it mattered what you said. When in a time before social media, where there were only a relatively small number of gatekeepers, basically, right? So newspapers, national television, national radio, things like that. Then, if you say something that is considered either false or offensive or something like that by one or more of these gatekeepers, you're done. Right? I mean, the difference between, let's say, the former president of the United States and the ones that preceded him, even just a few years back, is that if they had said 1/10 or even 1/100th of what Trump said, they would have lost their career. Their career would have been at the end immediately, right? Yeah. But now, because we do have this democratization, if you will, of the gatekeeping. In other words, there is no gatekeeping anymore. Anybody who has a blog or a Twitter account or a Facebook account can write whatever the hell they want.
Yeah.
And now, we usually tend to think that democratization of things is it's a plus. In this case, I have my doubts. I really would rather go back to a situation with the few gatekeepers that I can trust, as opposed to having to go to hundreds or thousands of different sources, and I have no idea who these people are. I do a Google search, for instance, on a particular topic, and what comes out most of the time is a mess. It's a lot of sites that I don't recognize, a lot of authors that I don't recognize, a lot of sources that I have no idea whether I can trust or not. And therefore, why would I want to go there and spend my time, invest my time reading about what they're saying or listening to or watching what they're saying? It's just like, no. So I am doing my own approach is going back to the gatekeeping. I have a short list of sites that I trust, depending on what the situation, what the context is, news sites or health sites, for instance, or whatever it is, and I only read stuff that comes from those very limited sites. It's not that I take whatever these sources say on faith. We should never take anything on faith, as far as I'm concerned. But you have to make a decision of who you trust and why. And if you make a mistake in that, you can, at the very minimum, waste a lot of time, and at worst, you can actually make mistakes that might be even fatal if we were talking about health-related matters, right? Now, you were saying, is this going to get better? No, it isn't going to get any better anytime soon. I read an article by Jonathan Haidt recently. Jonathan is a social psychologist at NYU. And he published an article in The Atlantic where he basically blamed almost everything bad that has happened in the world over the last 10 years on social media. Now, I usually don't necessarily agree with Haidt. I've had my little, disagreements with him, sometimes not that little. But in this case, I think he's 90% right. I mean, maybe not everything that has happened, but he has a point. And that point is precisely based on the observation. I mean, at this point, there's a significant amount of research on the dynamics of social media, the effects that social media have on social discourse, on public discourse, et cetera, et cetera. And, these things are designed to lower the level of discourse. There's one argument that could be made, and that actually I have made in the past, is, look, technologies are neutral. Technologies are just tools, right? It's like if I have in the other room, I have a hammer, and a hammer is a tool. It's up to me whether I'm going to use it to put up a picture on my wall or to, smash somebody's brain. It can do the two things equally, and it is entirely up to me to use it properly, meaning using it for hanging picture on the wall, or improperly, right? Smashing somebody's skull. The same, one could argue, is true for internet-based technologies. But recently, I've actually become convinced that is not true. That some of these technologies, at least some of these technologies, certainly in the case of social media, I'm talking about platforms like, again, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. They're clearly engineered for certain purposes. They are, there was an interesting article that came out a couple of years ago where the researchers showed that the Facebook engineer discovered at some point that the most attractive kind of posts were the ones that elicited the anger emoticon, right? When you right. Instead of saying like or clicking like, you click anger, right? Those are the ones that generate the most traffic, like 10 times more than something that people like. And so they engineered the site in order to favor those kinds of posts. So this is not random. This is designed in a certain way. Am I saying that Zuckerberg is evil? No, I'm just saying that he wants to make money, and he found a way to make money that is unfortunately detrimental to society at large. So I don't believe anymore that these things are actually neutral, and that is why very recently I just quit all of those platforms. I just said,
yeah. I noticed you don't have your Twitter feed up anymore, Massimo. How do I get hold of your pearls of wisdom now? Goodness sakes! But
I do have sites. I mean, I'm present on the internet, but not on Twitter or Facebook, because I really do think that those are the worst examples of what we're talking about.
Well, look, interesting you should say that, because when you mentioned gatekeepers, and the few gatekeepers that we had really were what was a mainstream media. And mainstream media, you can be critical of any which way you like. But with social media, in order for it to work effectively for the social good, it requires a great amount of self-discipline on behalf of the end user, which I argue the end user does not have. And I think that there's also a lot of fatigue in modern society. Everything's been outsourced to something else, and usually outsourced back onto the customer. So you have to go off and do everything yourself and still pay full price at doing everything. So it's kind of this weird.
What a deal, huh?
Yeah, it's a fantastic deal. Someone's making money, but you're being inconvenienced constantly. And I think again, when we're looking at social media, it's meant to be this neutral platform. But if you can't manage yourself on it, if you can't temper your own emotional outputs on social media, if you lack that self-discipline, and then it goes viral, I mean, of course, it's all going to come back at you at some point, and not in a good way, right? See, in Australia, we have this thing called cutting down the tall poppies, describing a wonderful national characteristic of criticizing, sabotaging, or otherwise attempting to hold back people who have reached the pinnacle of success professionally. Now, getting back to the whole Rogan issue, from a Stoic perspective, how should one approach the success of another? Should we celebrate and accept it, or should we criticize it?
Neither. From a Stoic perspective, somebody else's success is not my business. It's entirely irrelevant to me, because for the Stoics, the most important thing, in fact, arguably the only fundamentally important thing in one's life is one's own character, moral character. So I should be concerned only about my moral character, and whether somebody like Joe Rogan gets millions of hits or not makes no difference in terms of my moral character, and therefore it is an entirely indifferent matter as far as I am concerned. So now, of course, that's the theory. We're human beings, so we do tend to, we have a tendency to be jealous or to be envious and so on and so forth. But part of Stoic practice is precisely to train yourself not to be that way, right? to look at somebody who is doing better than you are. Forget about social media in any environment, right? At your job, you might have competition. You might have somebody, a colleague who is doing better, or a neighbor who is has a bigger house, or whatever it is. The whole thing is entirely irrelevant. Externals, as the Stoics call them, that is, things that don't belong to my character. Everything is essentially an external, are not important. They have some value, meaning that, I rather have a job than not, or I rather have a house than not, and so on and so forth, right? They are conveniences in life, but they don't really have the kind of value that I should be particularly concerned about. So when we're talking now, on the other hand, and this is probably part of why we're having these conversation. On the other hand, the Stoics are very concerned about social justice.
Yeah.
And in the broad term of the sense of the term, I'm not talking about so-called social justice warriors again on Twitter. I am talking about the broad term, social justice, as in we want a world that is as fair as possible, where there is as little inequality as possible, where there is no injustice, et cetera, et cetera. So the Stoics are very much concerned about that. And because one of the precepts of Stoicism is cosmopolitanism, the notion that every other human being on earth is my brother or sister, or as we would say today, whatever other gender they recognize. And therefore, I should be concerned about their well-being, and I should be doing whatever is in my power to improve their well-being. Whatever makes for a better society, for a better cosmopolis, is actually something that a Stoic should work toward. And that's why we're talking about things, people like Jordan Peterson, let's say, or Joe Rogan. It's not, the problem is not that they are famous or not, or that they're racking in money or not. That's irrelevant. What the problem is that they're doing damage.
But having said that they do damage, I mean, if we go back to the Rogan, we will visit Jordan B. Peterson in a moment, but looking at you'll love that one. Now, with regard to Rogan, he's done his contrition for so-called sins committed or mistakes made. I mean, should we now just simply move on and forget about it? And is it right for his listening audience to just return to listening to his podcasts, safe in the knowledge that these things won't happen again because he said sorry?
Well, I mean, again, everyone has to make that decision on their own. I do believe in contrition and apologies and things like that. I mean, it's like, people can be generally sorry, and they should be given the benefit of the doubt. However, it also comes down to a matter of trust, right? So we're talking about media and influencers, people who actually have a say at a national or international level. So why am I listening to somebody? Because I trust that person. And if it turns out that person is being lying to me, or is being saying false things, or is being behaving in a way that doesn't line up with my values, then that trust is being betrayed. Trust can be regained, but it's a long and painful process, right? And it should be long and painful process, because trust arguably is one of the most precious things we have. Let me give you just a completely different example. Let's say that I go to a mechanic. I have a regular mechanic for my car, right? And I've been going to this person for many years, and he's always fixed my cars with reasonable prices, et cetera, et cetera. But then one of these days, I discovered he's actually charging me more than a fair price. So in other words, he's been taking advantage of me. I'm going to have a really difficult time trusting that guy again, even if he apologizes. First of all, he apologizes because he's been caught. Not right. So that's the situation with Joe Rogan. He's been caught doing something, and therefore he has to apologize, because otherwise he may lose a significant number of people, and therefore revenues, et cetera, et cetera. So there is the underlying possibility there that the apology is not really genuine. Right?
I'm glad that you said that. I was going to ask you, are his apologies therefore genuine, based on the fact that he's bringing in all this money? We
don't know. I mean, it's certainly in the realm of possibilities that even though he's bringing in money and therefore has an interest in this thing, that his apology is genuine. But I am very, justified in doubting it, justified in saying, well, I don't know. Let's see how this goes, right? So trust is important. And by the way, trust is not important just for people, just for celebrities. It goes the other way also, the same way also for let's say scientists, right? That is why it is important that scientists or science communicators or public agencies like the Center for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, and all that sort of stuff, it's important that they cultivate the public's trust. Because once they make a misstep, they're going to lose some people. And even though the misstep may have been made in good faith, it's going to be difficult to gain back the trust of the people. That's why trust is a really underestimated, I think, in public discourse, thing of value. It's very valuable, and we should be really, really careful with it. Once you squander the trust that people have in you, you're going to be in a bad situation.
Isn't part of the problem also, Massimo, that the agencies responsible for communicating scientific facts or facts of any import are really not very good at communicating? I mean, it allows, celebrities to have opinions who then can mobilize a fan base around their opinion, giving them a sense of legitimacy, even though they can be talking out of their backside.
Yeah, no, that's true. And in fact, not just agencies, but again, also individual scientists and science communicators, they are really often, I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but often they're really not that good at communicating in a persuasive fashion. And there is a reason for that. These kinds of organizations like the WHO, the CDC, etc., or the kind of people that I'm referring to, scientists and science communicators, they tend to think that the key to good communication is to be accurate, factually accurate. Okay, they think that that's pretty much their business.
Yeah,
and that's because they haven't read Aristotle. Aristotle, in his book on rhetoric, which is still more than 2,000 years later, one of the best things ever written on the topic, makes clear that, yes, of course you want to have your facts correct, no question about it, because otherwise you're doing, your dereliction of duty. You have to get your facts straight and your arguments lined up correctly, et cetera, et cetera. But there are two other components to persuading people that are often ignored by scientists, science communicators, and official agencies. Those other two components are what Aristotle called the ethos and the pathos. The ethos has to do with character. It means character in Greek. It has to do with credibility. You have to establish your credibility. Now, a lot of my colleagues in the sciences say, well, I got a PhD, so what else do I need? Well, having a PhD in a particular field, let's say virology, is certainly a piece of what it takes to establish your credibility. But more importantly, you need to establish your credibility with the particular public that you're talking to, that you're trying to address. And that may require other things other than just adding 3 letters after your name. It might have to do with your track record of how you interact with people, the perceived agenda that you may have when you talk to people, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to communicate with people, not only you have to have the facts straight, that's what Aristotle called the logos, the logical part is that you have to have the ethos, and then you have to have the pathos. The pathos has to do, the word pathos means emotion in ancient Greek. So meaning that you have to connect emotionally with your audience. If you don't connect emotion to your audience, if you don't explain why they need to care about whatever it is that you're talking about, they're not going to listen. They're not going to be persuaded. And a lot of my colleagues, unfortunately, whenever they hear the word emotional connection, they run the other way at the fastest speed possible, because they're afraid that what I'm talking about is emotional manipulation, which of course is a bad thing, right? Like, oh, I just want to provide the facts. I don't want to emotionally manipulate people. Well, then you're setting yourself for a disappointment, because it's not a question of manipulating people. It's a question of connecting with people. It's different. You have, as I said, you have to make sure that people are listening to you because they realize that it's important to them, that there is an emotional reason for why they should be listening to you. By contrast, people like Joe Rogan and a lot of other celebrities are very, very good at the pathos. They are really good at the emotional connection. That is what makes them good podcasters. That is what makes them good, hosts of a show, et cetera, et cetera. They connect emotionally. Unfortunately, a lot of the times they're horrible at the logos, at the factual part, right? They get the fact. That is why arguably the best communicator would be a hybrid of somebody who is a entertainer, a comedian, or a host or something, and at the same time has a good grasp of the facts, a good grasp of the factual matters behind things. But that's really difficult to find. That kind of person is really difficult to find.
So basically, Joe Rogan needs a PhD, and then he'll be okay.
I have seen people with PhDs sputtering nonsense.
So believe me, so have I.
Right? Yeah. So a PhD is no guarantee, but it certainly would help because the fact is, we do have empirical quantitative data about this. It is certainly the case that more education, college level and postgraduate level, does not eliminate nonsense. People still believe in all sorts of, crap, even though they might have a good level of education. But it is equally clear that it does decreases the chances. So the more advanced your education is, the less likely you are to believe in all sorts of nonsense. So yeah, maybe that wouldn't solve the problem, but it would certainly help. But the problem, of course, as you know, is that there is no incentive for Joe Rogan to get a PhD. He's fine as it is. He's making more than enough money as it is.
Well, yeah, that's very true. But a thought just occurred to me. When you look at political discourse generally, but a lot of podcasting in particular, how much of it do you think is sort of like I'm trying to find the right descriptive here, so bear with me. It's kind of like indulging in sophistry in a way, right? So you've got the emotional content going. You can make those connections, and maybe there's a kernel of truth somewhere that somewhere in what you're saying. But when you do the double checking, you find out that it's way off the mark. It's not what you expect it to be. So how much of what we're experiencing right now with, celebrities dominating social media platforms is just reinforcing this notion that we're in a high time of sophistry?
Yeah, we are in the return. We're seeing the return of sophistry, right? Sophistry had hit the high mark in ancient Athens, and now it's back with a vengeance. There is actually a technical term that philosophers use for this, and that's bullshit. Bullshit.
I like that term. Cut straight to the quick.
Exactly. Now, bullshit. There's a famous short essay by Harry Frankfurt, who is a philosopher at Princeton University, with the title "On Bullshit." And Frankfurt makes this distinction between bullshitting and lying. Yeah. When somebody lies, they have to know where the truth is. Otherwise, they're not going to be effective liars. Okay. So they have, in other words, they have to have a certain respect for the truth and a certain understanding of the truth, because otherwise they're going to be caught lying if they're not good at manipulating the truth. But a bullshitter is exactly what you just described a couple of minutes ago. Somebody who throws at you a bunch of different things, some of which are actually true, others are clearly false, others are somewhere in between. They're kind of true but actually distorted, and he doesn't care. Because his goal is not to convey information. His goal is to manipulate you for whatever purpose, increasing, number of clicks on his website or number of listeners to his podcast or whatever the thing is. So, or political goals. That could be political goals. I think Donald Trump is a great bullshitter in that sense. I mean, if he's great at anything, he's great at bullshitting in this particular technical sense of the term. And that's why has been so successful, both in his pre-political career and in his political career. So the problem is that it's really difficult to defend yourself from a bullshitter, because if you're talking just about a liar, if you're careful and you do your background research, you will catch the liar. You would say, no, wait a minute, things are actually this way. But the bullshitter is really more difficult because it throws at you a lot of stuff that it's kind of a big ball of things that then you have to unravel little by little, and it's going to be difficult to unravel it. Also, because some of the things that the bullshitter tells you are in fact true or close enough to truth, that gets a lot of people. It says, oh, but so and so was actually right about that thing. Yeah, he was right about that thing, but did you notice he was wrong at another 9 of the 10 things that he told you? And yet people will pay attention, will get ensnared in sort of this web of bullshit, and it's really difficult to get out of it. I mean, you had to be, first of all, to know the phenomenon, to know the characteristic of the phenomenon, to learn how to recognize it, and to pay attention, to do the work to actually get out of it. In a lot of cases, people either don't have the time or the inclination, or frankly, the means to, I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, my parents, let's say, they watch something on television, they'll believe it very likely, because they don't have the background necessary to sort of say, wait a minute, hold on, what was that person saying? Who is that person? What kind of credentials do they have, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot of work. That's why we rely on fact checkers, for instance, right? Yeah. And that's why we rely on critics. That's why we rely on experts that are going to say, wait a minute, hold on, that actually is not the case. But again, I'm not optimistic that things are going to get much better anytime soon, because the dynamics are certainly against us in that sense. There is a principle in skepticism. So scientific skepticism is this pursuit of claims of these examination of claims of pseudoscience, right? And in scientific skepticism, there is a principle that basically says that it's really almost impossible to counter a purveyor of pseudoscience, because he will keep throwing stuff at you, and it will take 10 times as long to unravel the bullshit as it takes to throw the bullshit your way. So it's a never-ending losing proposition. And I've experienced this myself in person, where many years ago, I was living in Tennessee in the south of the United States, and occasionally I would be called to have a debate with a creationist. I was an evolutionary biologist, right? So there you go. And I was young enough and naive enough that I actually agreed to do it. I don't do that anymore.
Love them for punishment. That's what I say.
Exactly. But it was an interesting experience, because one of the things that became very clear to me very quickly was that a typical strategy of my opponent was to throw out in rapid succession 10 or 15 different things, like, what about this? What about this? What about that? And then it was up to me to unravel the mess and try to explain. But because the two of us had the same amount of time to speak, in 50 minutes, he could throw me 100 things. And in my 50 minutes, I would have only time to explain 3 or 4 of those, which left the audience, even if they believe me, it left the audience like, hey, Professor Pigliucci has not addressed this and this and this and that and then the other. Therefore, they won. Yeah. Just by throwing out mud, you can throw out the mud very easily, and then it takes hours to clean it.
Yeah, incredible. All right. Well, look, just to wrap this Joe Rogan section up. I mean, in an ideal world, Massimo, what do you think should have happened to Joe with regard to his errors of judgment? I mean, we spoke about his contrition or his lack of contrition with regard to his apologies, but what about some form of punitive sanction by Spotify itself. I mean, I understand that they get a lot of money out of him, and Rogan doesn't just bring himself to the table now. He's got a network of people, including Jordan B. Peterson, or including Sam Harris, or, you know, a bunch of other people, very powerful podcasters in their own right, you know, that he can bring to the table. So it kind of makes him feel, it kind of makes him appear invulnerable in many ways. Is it a case of, you know, Spotify has created a noose around its own neck, and they just have to basically ease off if they want to continue cashing in with Joe? I mean, what's the go there?
Well, so you would want, of course, a corporation to do the right thing, and you would be extremely naive if you expected that the corporation actually would go on and do the right thing. Yeah. So whenever I hear, for instance, terms like, you know, self-policing or you know, self-regulation, I think that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as self-regulation. That's why the regulation should be from the outside, right? So and unfortunately, of course, the only regulatory agencies that we have are governmental agencies. And so now that really does, of course, go back to what we were saying in the beginning, like, wait a minute, however, because if I have a government agency starting regulating speech on a private platform, that does potentially infringe on people's constitutional rights. However, those constitutional rights, so we probably should talk about that for a minute. Those constitutional rights are not absolute. Right? So you can, for instance, the right to free speech does certainly cover opinions. You know, you can have whatever opinion, however despicable it is, you're entitled to it. But you're not entitled to mislead people factually on things that may endanger their lives. The typical example is, it is not constitutionally protected speech to be in the middle of a theater and start yelling fire if there is no fire. You will be prosecuted. If you do that sort of stuff, you'll be prosecuted by the government. Why? Because you are endangering people's lives. Right. Yeah. Well, arguably, Joe Rogan has endangered people's lives, and therefore should be, in my opinion, should be prosecuted at by a government agency for exactly as if he had yelled fire in the middle of a movie theater. And the same should be true for any kind of celebrity who spouts nonsense about vaccines or anything that has to do with public health. Now, I'm sure that this kind of position is not going to be popular because people are going to cry foul. They're going to say, "Oh, so you trust the government as opposed to..." No, it's not a question of trusting. It's a question that the government is accountable in a democracy. The government is accountable to us. A private corporation is not. Spotify can do whatever the hell they want, or nothing, and they're simply not accountable. There's nothing that we can do other than regulating the behavior of that company via, you know, government intervention. Now, I am not in favor of big government, so to speak. I am just in favor of government of the right size that does the right things. So we can have a conversation, of course, about what that means. But for instance, there is a difference between right now between the United States and European governments when it comes to social media and other aspects of the internet, for instance, search engines, right? So the Europeans tend to be far more heavily regulatory than the Americans. And I have experienced both sides of that debate, and I've lived in both sides of the pond. And I can tell you, I much rather be following the European model than the American one, because it's meant to protect the public, the public, not in any kind of paternalistic sense, but in the sense of, you know, we don't want people with authority and reach to put out there stuff that is factually incorrect and potentially dangerous for the welfare of people. I mean, that seems like it would be a pretty obvious, you know, you cannot go this. There's all sorts of things that you cannot do because they endanger public health. You cannot stand at the corner around from my apartment and sell poison to people, right? You just can't do that, right? It's illegal. why not? Why doesn't that infringe the freedom of speech of the poison sellers?
Yeah.
Well, it does. It
And for good reason.
And for good reason, exactly. So again, that said, we do need to agree and to negotiate it. This is going to be a complex negotiation, which is going to change depending, over time and depending on the specifics of the situation. We need to negotiate just how much regulation you want and how much risk you can take. But the notion that these things should not be regulated at all, that I think is we're seeing that increasingly that's not tenable.
Mm-hmm.
That's why social media now are under, even in the United States, finally, there is a good number of politicians who is finally beginning to say, no, wait a minute, we need to hold hearings here and figure out what these people are doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it, because it might not be in the interest of society at large. So that is the only way forward. I really don't believe in self-regulation on the part of the industry. Whenever
look, I totally agree with you.
That.
It's not going to happen. But, from an outsider's perspective, as an Australian looking at the United States, it seems that, neoliberal capitalism and all its manifestations has gone absolutely over the top in terms of how they want to portray the nobility of earning money over and above everything else. And, I think that that's probably where they lose their balance. The Europeans, on the other hand, tend to have more of a grounded basis. Look, you can earn your money, but, you've got to be socially responsible. There's more of a balance in Europe in terms of their commitment to social responsibility as well as the other. But in America, if you ask, especially among, some Republicans, not all of them, but some of them would say, well, there should be absolutely no restriction on what I can do because this is the, home of the brave, land of the free, and go and bugger yourself off, let me do what I like.
Exactly.
Don't crowd me out, And I suppose in many ways you could say that perhaps has let America lead the way in many things internationally that the Europeans simply won't lead the way on. But sure. It's a fine balance. It really is.
Sure, it's but just yesterday, I was reading an article about this was in the Guardian about Peter Thiel, one of the billionaires who is most influential here in the United States, and he's a hardcore libertarian, and he actually went so far as saying that he's beginning to think that democracy isn't really a good idea.
Oh, great.
Because it puts too many constraints on his ability to make money. Right. It's like, wait, what? but it follows perfectly logically. I mean, from his perspective, that is perfectly logical. He's adamantly against any kind of social justice movement. He doesn't want certain people to vote and things like that, because that puts too much of a dent potentially in his ability to make money. Too much in the way of taxes, too much in the way of constraints on his business, and so on and so forth. And when you hear that kind of talk, you say, wait a minute, hold on a second here, what's going on? I mean, Elon Musk, one of my least favorite people in the world, I might have to disclose. He's been complaining about the possibility that his taxes are going to be raised by like 1%. Now, this is literally the richest man on the planet, right?
Yeah.
This is a guy that literally swims in money, and yet he's complaining about the possibility. It's not a reality yet. It's only a proposal that his marginal taxes are going to be raised by like 1%, while in my opinion they should be raised by at least 70%. Get one. Right. And then the interesting thing is, when I say something like that, I sound like a rabid liberal, which I'm not. Just ask my liberal friends. They don't think of me as a rabid liberal. But people really ought to paying a little bit more attention to pesky things like history. For instance, in the United States these days, today, when we talk about taxes on the super rich, and this notion that most of the taxes that the billionaires in the United States pay are at a very low level, 15% level or less, because they are based on investments, not on any kind of fixed income. And then when people talk about raising it to, let's say, 20%, there's an outrage, not only by the billionaires, but actually by a lot of people who say, no, that seems too much. They forget that right before Ronald Reagan came into power, the marginal tax rate on the highest bracket in the United States was 90%. 90. Not 19,
Yeah.
90, right? And even under Reagan was still about 70%. So this was only 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. So it's not like these things haven't not been done in the past. And they can be done, and I argue they should be done. And the reason they should be done is not that I find it offensive necessarily that there are people that are that rich. I actually do find it offensive because with poverty in the world, the notion that somebody could spend $40 billion to buy Twitter just because he wants to be in charge of it, it's bizarre to me. It's really offensive. But that isn't the reason. The reason to act on these things is because once you have that kind of money, you also have a lot of power. And you have exactly the kind of power that allows Peter Thiel to say, I don't really care for democracy, so I'm going to do things differently. Let me give you one example. A few years ago, Microsoft was beginning to get on the radar of regulatory agencies here in the United States for certain kinds of antitrust behaviors. So how did Microsoft react? They literally bought themselves a few politicians, and they wrote the law that allowed them to get out of that predicament.
Wow.
So now we're talking about, now you and I can't do that sort of thing. If all of a sudden I think, what, I would like to, pay less taxes. I can't go to a politician and say, hey, can you write a law that exempts me from certain things? But corporations can, billionaires can. And that is the problem. We don't live in the United States. We don't live in a democracy anymore. We essentially live in a plutocracy.
Yeah.
Where,
I agree with that.
A small number of people with a lot of money and power essentially makes most of the decisions. Yeah, we still have elections, but so does the Russians. So what does that matter? I mean, it's like, so what? We have elections, but those elections matter less and less because no matter who you elect into office, that person has to immediately start running for the next electoral campaign, which means that they need a lot of money.
And also they also have to be responsible to the party apparatchiks as well. And they're the ones that have all the power politically and ideologically. They will tell the candidate what to do. And if you know what's good for you, you'll just shut up and do what you're told, basically, right? So you can't ever expect the system to bring up, the savior. That person that will be the savior of those people who can afford that person, essentially. Yeah. Okay. Oh God, I'm rather depressed now. We still have to get through Jordan Peterson. That's okay. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from New York, we're speaking with Professor Massimo Pigliucci on the perils of celebrity. Massimo, another celebrity who has had an incredible rise to popularity for his stance on Canada's gender pronoun debate, as well as some of his themes in his best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, is Jordan B. Peterson. While waiting for a meeting earlier this year, I read a very interesting piece you wrote in answer to a blog by Justin Vacula, who suggested that there might be an overlap between Stoicism and many of Peterson's themes. You were quite critical of this idea. Can you, as a practicing Stoic, tell us why?
Well, first of all, we were talking about earlier about the possibility of a Joe Rogan with a PhD. Well, John, Peterson is definitely an example of somebody for whom PhD doesn't really make that much of a difference. That doesn't mean just because you have a degree, a high level degree, that doesn't mean you don't write a lot of nonsense. Look, Peterson is actually a very good example of bullshitter as far as I'm concerned, because he's an actual academic, or at least he was until recently, because he left the university recently. But he has his legitimate degree in a legitimate field and was working at a legitimate university. So by all external accounts or appearances, this guy is somebody has some credibility. But then you actually start listening to what he says on his YouTube videos or podcasts, or read what he actually writes, and he's like, wait, what? there is enough of a mix of what I was talking earlier on. That is, there's a number of things that Peterson says that are either true or close to true or sound as they might be true. And then they're mixed with a lot of other stuff. It's like, wait, where does that come from? And once you get this whole bundle nicely delivered, you have no idea of how to respond, because it's like, where do I start? And that's the hallmark of a bullshitter. Now, specifically, as far as the alleged Stoic credentials of Peterson, to be fair, he never actually, to my knowledge, he never actually claimed to be a Stoic or to practice Stoicism. But people, as you say, have actually been making that comparison. In fact, I know a lot of Stoic practitioners who think highly of Jordan Peterson for that reason. And it's really puzzling to me. Why? Because for one thing, one of the major hallmarks of Stoicism, as I said earlier, is cosmopolitanism. That is, therefore, a concern for social justice broadly construed. I don't see that in Peterson at all. Whenever I read the stuff that he puts out, or again I listen to him, I just don't see that coming through at all. In fact, he has made all sorts of comments that vary from the sexist to the misogynist, etc. And he's became famous, for one thing, for his alleged defense of free speech, and when it came to university regulations that were requiring the use of certain pronoun, of whatever pronoun somebody wants to go after, be called after. And he's like, so let's analyze that stance for a second. Certainly, I recognize that it is anybody's personal decision how to address somebody else. There's if I want to be an asshole and not call you by the proper name, then I have that right. So I understand where he's coming from. But what kind of person would make of that a literally an international case? It's like, what exactly is at stake here if somebody says, hey, I would like to be addressed in this way? Why is that so burdensome? Why is that the kind of thing that you focus on when it comes to defense of free speech? There are real serious issues about free speech in the world. There are people who are really seriously oppressed, right, in many places in the world. That I think the kind of stance, self-righteous stance that Peterson took makes a mockery out of real issues of free speech. It's like, why are you raising such a mess out of this thing? Why is it exactly that this is so important? And that you, in fact, can build your entire reputation on that sort of stuff. But the other thing is, I don't see any evidence in Peterson's actions as they're reported, as they're publicly available, because, of course, I don't know the guy personally, so I cannot assess his character personally. But I don't see any practice of the four cardinal virtues of, practical wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. I just don't see that happening. I don't see any, as I said, concern for, any kind of form of cosmopolitanism. I just don't see. The only reason people make that comparison at all between Peterson and Stoicism is because some of the things that he writes in the 12 Rules sound vaguely like character improvement, right? Put order in your room before you start criticizing others, that sort of stuff. Yeah, that sounds vaguely Stoic. That is something that Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher, might say. But that's also something that my mother said, and my mother was not a Stoic. So it's like, that's the problem. It's like, sure, we have some platitudes here that start with your own problems and then criticize other people on the other. Yeah, that sounds right. But this isn't something that is either original with Peterson or, in fact, original with Stoicism. It's just, as I said, pretty commonsensical. It's something that doesn't qualify you as a particularly brilliant person or as a follower of a particular philosophy. And then the other, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left, but the other major issue that I have with Peterson is actually pseudoscience. So the guy is a Jungian for one thing. So he follows the teachings of Carl Jung. Right there, that's problematic because Jung was into all sorts of fairly questionable notions, like the notion of archetypes, or these the kind of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis that Jung was into, which was a follow-up and reaction to Freud, is the kind of stuff that really doesn't, at this point in the 21st century, does not have any empirical foundation. And if you're doing, in my book at this point, if you're doing something in whatever science, including psychology, that does not have a empirical foundation, then the question is, why should I be listening to you? And the kind of things that Peterson does is a mix of Jungian archetype things and other notions that Jung had, and then references to different traditions he puts in. He mixes in things. I saw a video where he was mixing in things. I was talking about ancient symbols. I think it was Egyptian symbols, and how, doesn't that symbol look a lot like something? Sure, it looks like it. But what are you saying? What are you actually implying any causal connection? Are you actually trying to rewrite history and explain to us, something novel about what, let's say, the ancient Egyptians were doing? Because if you're doing that, then you need data. You need a real, serious empirical evidence. You need archaeologists on your side. You don't just look at something and say, well, doesn't that look vaguely like this other thing? Therefore, there is a connection. No, there is no therefore there. Lots of things look superficially like something else, and that doesn't imply anything. So a lot of what Peterson says is either superficial and platitudinous or bizarre, and it sounds intriguing, it sounds interesting, but there is no actual basis to it. And so overall, I'm asking about Peterson the same question that I ask about Rogan. Why? Why are there so many people who listen to these kind of sources and take whatever they're saying seriously? And it's hard to give a good answer to it. I mean, I'm inclined to say, well, that's because a lot of people don't have a high level of critical thinking skills. And that may be part of the answer. But I think also a more important answer is the one that we were talking about earlier. That is, people like Rogan and Peterson really can speak somehow to people at an emotional level.
Yes.
And therefore, they can manipulate people at an emotional level. And that is one of the things actually that Stoicism, I think, is particularly useful for, because it puts you on guard against emotional manipulation. It says, do not allow certain emotions, fear, for instance, anger, and things like that. I mean, Peterson is really looks like a really angry person, and and he does things that go in the direction of essentially using anger to pursue certain whatever it is that is your priority. Well, anger is a bad idea as far as the Stoics are concerned, right? Because it's the kind of emotion that overrides reason. It's actually defined in the Stoics think that the so-called unhealthy emotions are those emotions that tend to override reason. Fear is one of them, but certainly anger is a big example. And that is exactly what people like Peterson and Rogan are doing. They are overriding our ability to reason because they're talking straight to our emotional level, and therefore they get an immediate reaction out of us. And once somebody elicits that emotional reaction, then it's much more difficult to cut the connection. Now you have established a connection with that person, and it's much more difficult to cut it.
Actually, just on that, and going back to who would actually listen to Peterson, I mean, I will have to stick my hand up and say I did, and I think many people did as well. I did because, back in 2018, I suffered from a personal loss, and I took comfort from what Peterson's book said about dealing with things like that. And I think that it did pull me back from a very awful period, right? And while I understand and appreciate your criticism of Peterson's work, I mean, Was I wrong? Were other people wrong to have viewed Peterson positively during their times of trial?
Well, I mean, I cannot say whether people are wrong or right. What I can say is that there are plenty of better sources that can do the same job, right? So there are, we all find ourselves in that kind of situation you're talking about at one point or another in life, right? You know, we all go through personal loss or through difficult times, etc. And all I'm saying is that there are better resources out there. And so I can see the attraction again of somebody like Peterson, but given the many drawbacks that his approach has in terms of, you know, lack of scientific foundation, for example, and then you know, these mixing of things that are some which are true, some which are not, then why not go to a different source? I mean, in my case, of course, Stoicism has been very helpful. I rather have somebody like Epictetus or Seneca talk to me than somebody like Peterson, and they've been helpful, however, in the same kind of way. They you know, I really reached for those sources when I was going through you know, a hard time. It doesn't have to be dead people, of course. It can be, you know, there are modern practitioners, and not just within Stoicism. If we're talking about therapy, for instance, instead of psychoanalysis, either Freudian or Jungian or Adlerian or whatever you want, why not go for cognitive behavioral therapy, which actually has a far more solid foundation from a empirical perspective, from a scientific perspective, and yet you still have a professional therapist who will still help you going through whatever it is that you need to go through. So the question is, it's understandable. The issue is, it's understandable why people, especially people in distress, obviously, are attracted to the certain kinds of things. But to me, I'm going to try to be careful about this, because I don't want to be offensive, not only to you, but to any of your listeners. But this is one reason why, for instance, I criticize people who go to, let's say, a psychic. Right? So psychics are usually honest bullshitters. You know, most psychics actually believe what they're saying. They really believe that they can help people, but they can't, in the sense that they cannot do what they claim that they can do. However, plenty of people, of course, go to a psychic, and they are taken advantage of, in a sense. Not even willfully necessarily. As I said, a lot of these people, a lot of psychics are actually, you know, they're convinced that they're doing a good job, and they're actually being helpful to people. But nevertheless, what they're doing is based on stuff that doesn't make sense, that doesn't deliver in what it's supposed to be delivering. And yet, people who are in emotional distress are attracted to them, because who wouldn't, right? If you tell me, hey, you lost your son or your daughter or your husband or your wife, and I can put you in contact with them, or I can tell you what they want, and so on. I mean, that's really tempting, right?
Yeah.
But it is not right. It is not right, because ultimately it is damaging, because it's an untruth. It's a falsity. So you're basing your emotional recovery, you're basing your way to deal with your distress on things that are false. There are alternatives. There are people who are genuinely, actually, not only genuinely trying to help you, but they actually do it on the basis of reality, and not on the basis of things that are made up. So although I understand and sympathize with people who are attracted in those directions, ultimately, I think it does become a matter of ethics, both personal ethics. I don't want to condone anybody who is bullshitting, and the ethics of the person who does it. If the practitioner in question ought to do their research, they are, I think, ethically bound to do their research and to say, wait a minute, this thing doesn't actually work. This thing, you know, it's not based on anything. Therefore, what am I doing here? But it's difficult. It's really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. Can you say that the arrival of Peterson has had any sort of positive impact on public discourse and philosophy generally? Even if you don't agree with his themes or his belief systems, can you say that there's an objective good, a virtue perhaps, in being able to bring a sense of deeper thinking to the public? I mean, there've been some very interesting debates between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, or between Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek, for instance. I mean, they were quite engaging, and maybe you don't take the Peterson view, but you could take the Harris view instead. The idea of having this sort of public dialogue, has this actually helped the public get into philosophy in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have even bothered engaging in, you know?
It's a good and fair question. I'm afraid my answer is going to be no. I blame people like Sam Harris for giving a platform to people like Peterson, because that raises their level of, you know, acceptability by the general public. So, oh, well, this is essentially what I was doing with creationists, and that's one of the reasons I stopped doing it. Because, you know, you wouldn't believe how many creationists kept asking me for years, and still occasionally I get requests for, like, you know, would you like to do a debate with me? Now, at some point I started asking myself, why do these people want an expert in that field to debate them? What are they getting out of this? And what are they getting out of it is that they can say to their followers, hey, I was in the same stage with a professor of evolutionary biology, and he took my arguments seriously enough. Therefore, don't you think that there is something in there, right?
Right.
So I'm afraid that I need to criticize Sam Harris and people like that for providing a platform that ultimately I think lowers discourse. Because yes, of course, it can certainly happen that somebody watches a debate like that or a conversation like that, and then they get interested in philosophy or science. You know, people do all sorts of things, and they arrive at all sorts of places by a number of different routes. So it can definitely happen. But overall, I think that actually lowers the level of discourse. I would much rather have a conversation between, you know, two actual psychologists who know what they're talking about and they're doing science, or two neuroscientists, or, you know, about free will, about you know, big issues in that concern human emotions and how to handle them. I'd rather have that than a discussion with somebody like Peterson. You mentioned also the other guy, Stoic, and he's like, that's another good example of somebody who, it's not exactly clear what he says.
Is that because of his accent?
No, well, that's part of the problem. But no, it's just like, it's one of those things where, you know, some of the stuff that he says, like, yeah, I can sympathize, or I can figure out what he's saying. And then other stuff is like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And a good philosopher should be doing better than that, I'm afraid.
Right.
But unfortunately, and that goes back to what we were saying in the beginning, you know, serious thinkers, serious good philosophers, good scientists, et cetera, they hardly get a platform these days, precisely because people go for, unfortunately, the minimum common denominator. And like Jonathan Haidt, I'm going to blame social media for it.
Yeah, good on you. Finally, in the end, celebrity isn't a phenomenon specific to modern times. The Stoics of old also had to contend with public figures who had their own cult of personality surrounding them. What lessons can we learn from our ancient forebears in the way they handled their version of celebrities?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that it not only about celebrities, but one of the questions that I'm often asked whenever I talk about Stoicism or skepticism or any of the ancient philosophies is why? Why should we listen to what people were saying 2,000 years ago, or 2.5 millennia ago? After all, we don't, if you're interested in physics, you don't pick up Aristotle's book on physics. If you're interested in biology, you don't go and read Aristotle's biology. So why should you read Aristotle's ethics? And the difference is that in terms of science, we've made a hell of a lot of progress. And therefore, it really wouldn't make any sense if you're interested in biology or physics to pick up Aristotle. But in terms of human nature, we haven't changed a bit. If you go and read what the ancient Greeks and Romans were writing, they were writing about the same exact things that we are concerned with today. Of course, they did not have iPhones and social media and stuff like that, but they cared about the same things. They wanted the same things. They were afraid of the same things. I mean, there's one of my favorite bits is Seneca in one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, who complains about the noise coming from the street, and he can't write. He cannot focus because there's a lot of noise. Well, I live in New York. I know exactly what he was talking about, right? Here we are 2,000 years apart, and yet I can sympathize with this guy because I know exactly what he's talking about. So the same goes for how to deal with celebrities. You're absolutely right. Celebrities or bullshitters were around 2,000 years ago, and they're around now, and you deal with it in the same way. You cultivate your own critical thinking. You cultivate your own character. You pick good people to listen to. People who actually know what they're talking about. Seneca says again to his friend Lucilius, don't just read widely and listen to anybody. Pick a small number of authors that are worth reading, and then focus on those. Go deep rather than wide, because otherwise you're going to be wasting a lot of time, because most of what's out there, it's not that good. I don't know the percentages, but I would say if you just do a random search on the internet, probably 95% of the stuff you find, it's crap. It's not useful. And that is a lot of crap out there. That means that you need to be discerning, because otherwise you're going to waste a lot of time, or worse, you're going to end up adopting notions that are going to be actually deleterious. The ancient answer is still valid today. Shut out a lot of this stuff. Focus on a smaller number of people that you trust, and especially focus on self-improvement in the specific sense of becoming a better person. The Stoics thought that becoming a better person, it's not just a moral thing. That is, you don't become a better person just by, in terms of ethics, but also in terms of reasoning. They thought that good reasoning is a virtue. They thought that scientific understanding of the world is a virtue. Right. So when you cultivate yourself, when I say that the ancients told us to cultivate ourselves, I don't mean just becoming a better person morally, which of course it's important. There is no question about it. I mean also improve your reasoning abilities and improve your understanding of how the world works. And to do that, you probably need to shut a lot of stuff out. Instead of getting out there and keep and look widely. Try to filter as much as possible. Look, there is an argument that can be made that one of the most important abilities of human beings is the ability to pay attention. Nothing, the Stoics would say, nothing has ever been improved by not paying attention to it. If you want to go and have a disaster, just be distracted, don't pay attention. And yet we live in the 21st century, arguably in a society that goes competitively after our attention, that distracts us all the time. And so what we need is really effective filters. We need to filter out a lot of this crap. And if that means not going on social media, by all means. If that means shutting down your iPhone or your computer, by all means. I think that's not a bad idea at all.
Very wise words indeed, Massimo. Thank you again for sharing your insights on the focus.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York, Professor Massimo Pigliucci. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our returning guest, Massimo Pigliucci, and to producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. So if you like what you heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus. Thank you very much, Massimo. That was fantastic.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much. I'm going to rush